I'm a professor, so I like, my job is to stand in front of rooms and like pretend I know what I talk about. So this is like nothing, no. Let me, before, I'll do my intro slides first, and my who am I, and then which I just told you anyway. And this is the talk. It's called Content Management System, and this was once actually a forum post on the Joomla.org forums. Who is Elin wearing? So I just thought I'd say who I am. I do a lot of different things around the Joomla project, but right now, mainly what I do is do development and work with developers. So I'm not a great developer, I'm an okay developer, but I spend a lot of time talking to other developers and trying to engage people with contributing to the Joomla core and trying to, in particular, facilitate like high skill, but everybody's skill, developers to be interested in building on the Joomla platform and writing some of the harder code that's part of that. So for example, this summer I worked on mentoring Summer of Code students and helping administer the Summer of Code project that we feel was really successful. The other recent thing I've done is with Jen Marriott, I co-authored the official Joomla book, which soon to be in second edition in December. You'll be able to get it in bookstores, but you can actually buy now if you want. The e-version, which is called Rough Cuts, they call it, and so it's the current page, I believe right now it's the page proofs, so I'm proofreading the page proofs right now, but you know, they're nice, it's like nothing's changing, like you're not allowed even to make changes that change the page flow at this point, so it's pretty close. There might be a few typos. And it's all it's 3.0 and 2.5, but it's 3.0 first. So and so the big thing for us has been how can we change the screenshots, because it was changing until quite recently. And one of the other questions on this thread, people always ask me like, who else are you? And on that thread, Steve Burge asked that question, like, did you by any chance write a book about the Russian mafia? And I was like, yeah, that's me. So in my other side of my life, I am a sociology professor, and I do study like white collar crime and organized crime and other kinds of criminology things. And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
How do you balance your time?
Not very well.
How much do you
Well, I mean, I have a full-time job, right? So I have a full-time job. But I do spend, I mean, the nice thing about being a professor is you do have flexible hours as long as you get your work done and show up for your classes and get your grades in on time. So I spend most of my time being my full-time job, but I spend a lot of my off hours doing Joomla stuff. That's my main hobby, I would say. And, you know, I'll do things like Friday, I came out here for the conference, but I'm leaving Sunday night, so I can be back to teach on Monday morning at 10. So it's always the job first, but Joomla for fun, more or less, most of the time. And can I just get a sense of who's in the audience? Like, how many people here would consider themselves mainly coders? So a few people are coders. How many people would mainly say like site implementers? So that's probably the biggest group. And what's that? What's everybody else?
In between.
In between, somewhere in between, which is the vast majority of Joomla people, I think, is people, when you are a site implementer, you do have to learn enough code to fix stuff and to integrate stuff and to make things work together really well. So this is actually a good, a good topic for implementers, because this whole issue of where do we go with CMS4 is really important in terms of making that process easier. So was anybody here at my talk yesterday, at the, actually not talk, the working group meeting yesterday? A few people, excellent. So based on the working group discussion yesterday, I kind of changed things around a little bit, but of course there's like 3 people here from that, but that's okay. The title comes from a basic idea, which I think this important question of where is it that we go next with the what we call the Joomla CMS. So, you know, we have the Joomla CMS and we have the Joomla Platform, and the CMS is this massively successful content management system that we all love but have frustrations with. And it's a little bit old. It's basically the content, what's called the content model is the same content model that we had back before we were Joomla. It's basically the Mambo 4.5.2 content model. And it was a brilliant, innovative, forward-looking content model at the time. And the more I learn, the more I admire what Andrew and the others were really able to achieve with that implementation, and then with 1.0 and 1.5 is when I first started really trying to understand code, because I was mainly a site builder and who, you know, kind of an implementer, but not just for sites I was doing personally or for nonprofits that I worked with. And so, you know, I think looking back, it was incredibly forward-looking. There were some really smart decisions that were made about splitting administration, kind of the back-end management from the front end, and about how to just think about certain things in a about making everything overrideable and extendable was like really important. So it was incredibly smart, but I think today we have this chance to be very forward-looking again, and that means not being afraid to maybe take a bit of a plunge in terms of moving forward in a somewhat radically different direction in terms of the content model, certainly, and then just thinking about what the CMS is like and what the purpose of the CMS is. So, I want. And then, like, longer term, where do we want to be looking after that? Where do we see the web going? But also, as people, Andrew and Lewis and others keep reminding us, the world is much bigger than the web today. You know, the world is apps, and apps are not the web, right? So what does that mean for this traditional model of a web-based content management system? Is quite challenging to think about that. So, and what does it also mean that, you know, an awful lot of content is not original content on sites anymore. It's sites that's originally created on Facebook, content that's originally created on Facebook, or content that's originally from some other source, and it's reformatted and shuffled and organized in creative ways, but it's not necessarily content that's made by doing submit article. So how do we think about that? And both on the side of how do we make sure we can still have, I mean, I think Joomla is really important because it does empower people to create original content. And that's incredibly important for me as someone who's interested in this project, is I want to help people tell their stories on the web and in other places, and tell their stories, advocate for their causes, provide information to the world. And so I want to do that. I want to be a content provider, but also I think it's really important to understand how the CMS today works as a content consumer, and then reshuffler, mashing upper. So those are the kinds of things that I've been thinking about, and I think that I could say that the core developer, the platform developers have been thinking about, and other people around the Joomla world. And the reason, so this was what I came up with as thinking about, well, now, if we want to take a radical leap, if we say CMS4 might be something really different, like what is it that we mean? And so this is just what I came up with as a goal, which is to make a modern, highly efficient and flexible system for managing web content. So it's still something that's for the web, because I think stuff that's for the web is for the web, just like stuff that's an iPhone app is for an iPhone. So it's still valid to have a web application, but there's also this other side that has to do with providing services to those other applications. But for the CMS side, that's what I think we mean. Whether we call it a CMS is a different question. And then I had to think about what do we mean by content. What do we mean by content? And this is a really interesting question once you start to think about it, because traditionally in Joomla, what we have mainly thought of as content is things that are in the components, the main, what used to be called in Mambo days the main body of the page. And today, you know, we kind of think of content a lot more broadly. It's basically, one way to think of it is it's everything that renders in the web. Everything that's in the browser is your content. So it's from the big piece, which might be a full article, to small pieces of navigation, or even just the date, right? Are all pieces of content that you're sharing with your users. So one way to think about it is just anything that appears in the browser. Another way to think about it is anything that has a URL, which is, it's kind of a profound thing to think about. Like an image has a URL, right? Even though you're not necessarily, even independent of ever being in a page, an image has a URL. So an image is a kind of content. And this is Ofer Cohen, who's been one of the people talking about this, came up with this definition. The textual web content is a textual, visual, or oral content that is encountered as part of the user experience on websites. It may include, among other things, text, images, sounds, videos, and animations. So again, it's like, let's think big about what do we mean by content, and then come up with ways of handling that. And then the management question is really about, to me, the control and organization of data, its structure, things like copying and moving data, organizing who can see data, which pieces of data, what they can do with it, things like the cache and the session management, configuration. There's all these things that happen in the back end of Joomla that are real management tasks. All those little more, you may not, there's 37 separate components in Joomla, right? 37 separate components. Most of us just think about com content, right? But there's not. There's com cache, there's com check-in, there's com menus, there's just com admin, com config, all these different pieces. And to me, those are the management tasks. Like just thinking about how do you configure a website, configure applications, that's an important task. So, and that's a management task. That's not a content task. So for me, and I will say, this is an opinionated thing. This is not some official thing from the Joomla project. This is me thinking about where I think we should go. To me, we should separate out those management tasks from thinking about like the content tasks. So content creation and content rendering, those are content tasks to me, and management tasks are all these other things. So that's where I am with the management question mark. And then the system is basically, how do we put these elements together? So how does the content side of things I've been thinking about it lately as like a web rendering application, and you can also think about it as like a web service consumer application. If we think of the database that the system has as basically providing services to the front end. And in Joomla now, it's not really in a literal sense, but we could think of what's happening in the back end as basically providing data and interactions with data to the front end. So we can think of that front end web rendering application as a services consumer. And services being, do people know what I mean by web services? So if you think of Google Maps, right? So it's like something you can pull in, but you can interact with. That's the difference, right? So there's the interaction side. And just like on Google Map, you can zoom, you can put a marker, you can do all those kinds of things, whatever the programmer has done to enable you to use the Google API. That's what we're talking. That's how I think we should think of this front end application. So, that's how I'm thinking along those lines. I was going to show, so after yesterday's group, so I had a big crowd yesterday, and everybody's like, I said, maybe tomorrow we should talk about code. And everybody was like, yes, yes, yes. And now there's like 3 people in the room to talk about code. How many people have heard of the unified content model? So most people have. So how do we get there? How do we get to this new modern web? I think to me, the unified content model is the way to get there. Some people call it universal content model. Andrew calls it universal model. Lewis calls it unified model. It's a little bit of a split, but we can call it whatever we want. The basic structure of the unified content model as it exists right now, which may change. I mean, things are always changing, and we have, like I said, 18 months to get there. So, some of these details may change. But so the people, the eBay crew basically created this unified content model for something they were doing, and they've shared it. And so this is kind of giving those of us who are thinking about it a framework for thinking about it. So you might have seen, I don't know if people saw the website that I made using this class. I'm gonna, hang on. Let me just pull up for a second. This is a website that I made with the eBay model right after they pushed it. So there's been a lot of development since then. Like, this was before the new MVC classes were pushed into the platform. But this is, and this is on the web. So this was just an example. And what I had done was just take, our existing content data, sample data at that time, and more or less use the unified content model to, I didn't put all the data, well, there's not a lot of data in that one. This is just a web. So I just put I imported it very easily. All of the sample data that was in there, and used it in basically recreated all of the views and then some. And I also added, so one of the cool things about the unified content model, the idea of unified content is that it's all content, right? Everything is content. And what we should have is different content types. We should stop thinking of com content, com contact, com web links, com news feeds, just as for the 4 obvious examples. And we'll throw com banners in there also. We should stop thinking of those 5 as different kinds of content. We should think of them as all content. And so what you can do then is say if you have types of content instead of many different things, you have one thing called content that has different variations. That actually opens up a really big world of possibility in terms of what you can do. So taking the original sample data, if you're familiar with the 2.5 sample data, there's quite a bit of it, and there's a lot of different formats and so on. So I actually created 2 things. One was, there's one part of the sample data where we put photos of a photo gallery. It's an example of how to make a simple photo gallery just using com content. But what I did here was just say, I'm going to define, actually, the interesting thing here is I defined a content type called image, and then putting together a bunch of image content items, I built up something called a gallery. Right? So it's like one record for each image, but then each image is basically a list, but formatted in 2 columns, So there's, and that's a new content type. So there's actually implied there 2 content types. One is image and one is gallery. And I also did the famous fruit encyclopedia. Instead of sticking the fruit encyclopedia into com contact like it is now, I just made a content type called encyclopedia. And then I could just put the fields that I wanted. But it's just a simple content type. So, so it's very easy to work with this new unified content model, because it has this idea that you create different types. There's basically Let me go back to my slideshow. So as I,
Mind the question?
no, not at all. I'd be thrilled.
At this point in your analysis of it, is there a kind of a role for a curation layer, kind of a crowdsourced quality rating that influences how you display and sort?
Absolutely. And actually, the way they built it, and so one of the things I'm going to say is that they've built this thing called JCon. They built like it's JContent is the main package, and then there's 2 classes that they added, J database object and J, oh no, it's the they, the JCache object and then there's this authorization package I'm not going to talk about because Andrew talked about that recently on the mailing list, and if anybody wants to look at it, they can. I'm just going to look a little more closely at JContent, but I'll say that there's room for discussion in how we don't have to do it just the way it's sent to us, because it's open source. If we're using this code, we can modify it as we want. But they have built into that both featured as a core. So the way it's set up is there's a core content table with a set of fields that are core fields, and they're going to apply across all content types. And we've had quite like there's a very, very long thread on the platform mailing list about this, and much of the discussion is about what fields should be core fields and what fields should not. And I'm not going to we talked about that some yesterday also, so I'm not going to get into it. But in the current table, there's a featured value, which is useful for that, and also there's a liked, basically a liked thing that kind of, in the old Joomla and current Joomla, you can really think of that as replacing voting. Like we have voting now, but the liked just replace that. And we can talk a little bit of how they have that structured, but it's really a core value. And I think that part of the reason for doing that is so you can do some curation like that. Both like automated based on what's popular, and then also based on the featuring is more what you use for a formal curation kind of thing, I would say. So that's the and that's the argument, I think, for having those things in the core table. There's like a debate. Part of the debate we had yesterday was, and we've been having for 10 months, is like how core are some of the core things and how many should be in like table number 2, and it has to do with multilingual and other things as well. So but the basic concept is you have one big table, and then you have supplementary tables that contain basically the extra fields, and they get put together. So so the 4 I just showed you before, there's authorization, there's content, and then there's 2 new classes inside of there. So the content table is all the common fields. The type table is where we're doing this thing of defining content types. So this is really important. It's what everybody wants to do, is to be able to flexibly define types. And part of the limitation of the old model has been we have these fixed types, and to get a new type, you have to install this big thing called a component. And then you get your extra fields, and you get whatever, and you have a ton of duplicate code, and you're doing the same thing over and over again, and everybody's wasting a lot of time, and it's hard to maintain. So, and you have to worry, oh my gosh, we want to go to 3.0. My component developer has not updated yet. What are we going to do? But if everybody's kind of the beauty of it is, part of the beauty of this idea is that a lot of those complications kind of fall away, because if everybody's in this core table and everybody's using types, then it's there. So there's this basic thing, content type. People were asking me about this yesterday. It's a very simple idea. It's a very simple table, and all it does is give like a name and an alias and the table that is going to be the supplemental table. So, and you don't have to have a supplemental table, but you have to have a row, even if it's not. So, and there's definitely ways I can see that the Joomla community is going to use that in very creative ways. So, But it's very, and one of the things we need to do is to figure out the easy way to do this. But to start off with, you know, the business model for some people is going to be providing custom types that are complex. It's going to be, there'll be simple types that people can make themselves, but some types will be much more complex. So that's the type table. And then we have the supplemental table or secondary table. That's everything else that you might need. And then this is like the most important to me, like a really important set of lines, which is basically saying we're going to go ahead and take the main table and the supplemental table or secondary table and put them together, and we're just going to act like it's one table and one object. And so we're going to be able to do all kinds of cool things with it, whatever we want to do. So it's just like very from the user end and from the developer end, where you're building like a higher level application. That's really easy. That makes the fact that that's taken care of for you makes life really easy. And then there's this JContent class package that this is really because of what people told me they wanted yesterday. They just said, we want to understand like how you make a content item and how you make code. And this is really all almost straight out of the documentation for the package. But it's really easy, right? It's incredibly easy to do the basic operations in terms of creating content, doing the basic the CRUD operations of creating and updating and deleting content. And it's all really tightly put together. There's like this factory class that makes it really simple to use. So you're just always going to be working through the factory in there. And like, how do you make a type? We don't have a front end for that, but the back end for making the type is really simple, right? We're just going to add it and create a new one. And then we need the mechanism. I mean, what we need on the CMS side is for people to build out like the actual front end of what that looks like. How do you name a table, you know, basically, you know, how do you input a name of a table, and how do you define what the fields are for that table and what the characteristics of the fields are. So, but, you know, then it comes down to create. And then in terms of then how are you actually going to create content, what we think of as content items in the Joomla world, it's really, again, pretty simple. You know, if you're just working to that factory, you're going to, you know, make an object and get it for in my playing around with it, I'm basically always like getting a particular type of object, of content type. And this is just straight from the manual. I admit it's not original at all, but it's just telling you how you can extend these basic classes, right, out to do different things. And it's very familiar in a way to Joomla people, in that there's a naming structure there, and there's kind of a built-in searching for finding the appropriate files based on a common pattern of naming structures. And it's very well documented in terms of where it's going to look if you give it a certain name. So this would be how you. So this is one of the things I think is it solves a ton of problems for us that we have in the CMS right now. So creating a new item, right, is one of the issues we have now. You kind of forget if you use the CMS all the time, but there's a lot of things you can't do until you save, right? You can't order. If you have a content plugin, you can't really. If you have like a form plugin, it's not really going to work until you save. There's a lot of things like that. So what happens in JContent is there's actually like a temporary article created or contemporary item created when you first do the article create. So right away, it's going to give you those basic fields of ID, the type, the date, the user ID, the state, and this temporary field, which is really important. So it's going to start off as a temporary, and until we have the initial save, and then it's not going to be temporary anymore. So we have this great temporary item there, and we're going to be able to work on it, edit it, and then if we don't want it, we can throw it away. But like, as I said, the great advantage is we don't have to wait for that first save to get anything. Then we can either save, well, we would save, and it does, it's kind of interesting. It does the checkout, and then you're going to put in the title usually, and you would definitely need to put in the title, and then it's going to do like an update, and that's when it's going to add the values for those fields. So it's going to give you your modified. So we had create date, right? But now anytime you save, and save is like what we mean by save now, not what we used to mean by save. So it's like apply. It's going to give you the alias that is automatically generated from the title, just like we've always done, and the modified date and who modified it and the revision number. And then when you have like the save and close, when we have a UI, that's when you would either have save and close or cancel, right? So, and that would basically be, cancel would be like throw it out, and save and close would be to promote it to not being temporary anymore. And if you, the other cool thing, just like a nice detail, nice little grace note of this is that, of course we have checkout, and it's still it's not Google Apps. It's not for collaborative editing at the same time. So we're still going to check out an item when someone's editing it. It's kind of nice because it does save the checkout. And if you, do the whatever user error it is that you're going to leave a checked out article there, it'll actually expire eventually. So you don't always have to be doing these check-ins for checked out items, which is kind of nice. And for me, it was kind of weird because I was like making a lot of items, and you can write a little script pretty well. I had a little thing where like if I refreshed, it made a new content item, and then there'd be all these items there, and then I'd come back like a few days later, and I'd like open it up and look at the thing, and then all of a sudden like all those checked out things would just they'd be gone. They'd be gone away. And so it's kind of cool. So that's what's happening there. And it's really easy to load up an item. I mean, you saw basically in the one I showed you, all I'm doing is loading. So like, I think almost entirely that, oh, I forgot, I missed one, converting the little arrows. That's really simple, like I showed you on my little web app that I made. Just loading stuff all over the place. It's all you need is to generate the ID and know what type you're doing. You don't even, well, you're going to do get content, and then you're going to, you do actually have to say what type it is. You do always have to say what type it is. And it doesn't just get that automatically from the record, which I don't know why, but but then you give the ID and it just loads it, and it loads it really nicely. And in my example, by the way, I mentioned that I had made these new content types. I actually have other content types in there, like navigation. So I just decided I don't really have modules, and even though there are menus and stuff, I don't like. This kind of gets rid of the idea of a module that's just a content module. There'd be other things, but if it's just text, then it doesn't really need to be something special called a module. It can just be another kind of content. So all my menus are just like unordered lists, and I just am doing this all over the place. Even though I'm not going to show you the actual things. This is delete. Again, very simple, easy to use. So I think this is like, all right, so that's the end of those slides. So I think like one of the things we're seeing with this is that it's a very high, it's really simple to use for like developers like me who like want to be able to use something pretty easily and build something pretty fast. So J-content by itself combined with the other packages there, because it's just handling so much. Like, think of what we have to do usually now if we want to save something, right? It's really a pain. You have to build up this whole structure to do that. And I mean, it's okay, but this is so much easier. So, okay, 10 minutes. So that's some of the basic premises of and how to use J-content. What we were talking about yesterday at the working group meeting is that we may start trying to work on building an application using J-content that may or may not end up being something that would be distributed, but more or less to help the people who are working on that learn how to work with that. And also one of the challenges, I think, for people who are coming from the old CMS is just learning how to work with some of the other newer structures that are there, like working with the new MVC and figuring out how do we want to do things like organize our file structure. Like, do we want to, if we're going to have these content types, are we going to give each type different folder? Like, each type has, if it has its own layouts, where are we going to put them? How are we going to put the forms and the form? And obviously you would get the, it's really easy to get the forms. If you look on my repo, you'll see that I have, forms for all the content types that I have. Do we want to organize those forms and the layouts into the same folder, or do we want to put all the forms into one folder and all the layouts into another folder? And we have a lot of other kinds of decisions to make too, like where we're going to put the layouts. So like people who, the CMS, the thing about having like 10 million users or whatever it is that you do have to build a really good infrastructure for them and then let them break it, but you have, what the core is has to be really solid. And so like if you look at a lot of the example platform applications, the layouts are always like in the template, in the CMS we call the template or theme, and that's not really going to work for the CMS, because the CMS people want to have like 300 different templates. So you wouldn't want to have them have copies of everything, and also you need a core copy that those can override. So it's a little different than if you're just building, like one of the nice things about the platform is you can just build a fast single purpose application for this context, and that's great, but it's not really going to work for a mass market plug and play, anybody in the world can build a website application like the CMS. So so there's a lot of, this is why it's going to take 18 months to figure out how to make all these kinds of decisions and figure out what works best. I thought the talk last night, the keynote, was really good in saying we have to have, you start better with a lot of different ideas that are competing with each other and try to figure out what's the best one. So, one thing is, a good thing about having these repositories out there is just that people can take them and play with them and see what they come up with. So I guess I'll take questions. Yes, Jonathan?
How do you see the plugin system, the on content for all those plugin callbacks applying to all of these?
Yeah. Well, it's not all of these. It's this. It's this.
To the UCM itself. So
Yeah. Yeah, like on content. Yeah. Those things are just, see, it's really, you have to get your mind around the idea that there's not all these different things, there's just this one thing. And one thing I will say is that in the CMS, to like from 1.6 forward, we've been kind of preparing for unified content. Like you'll see, we've added fields, so we've standardized all the fields, and the content events run in the core. Like the content events run in all the content components. So those 5 content components, I don't know if they run in banners, but definitely the 4 content components that that we usually think of. So we've really tried to kind of move people in this direction of thinking we need to have these standard things, even if they seem a little bit odd right now, they're going to make sense in the future. And we've kind of done that partly makes the life of managing the code base of the CMS easier to have things more standardized. But a lot of it is just to help people, if we have this standard where everybody is starting to think, I'm going to have a created date and a modified date and a created author and a modified author, and I'm going to have featured, like all the core content ones have featured now. They all have revision now. They all have basically the core fields that are in, except for likes, all the core fields that are in the J content package. They're easily mappable. So like the hope is always, since a lot of people are developing new things, just copy from the core extensions, that'll kind of become the practice. And that, I know one thing that people worry about a lot is what's going to happen to my data and what's going to happen to my extensions. And so the more people are kind of following those practices, the easier that kind of moving is going to be. So that's going to be good. And